The crush wasn't a thunderclap. It was more like the slow, creeping growth of ivy, something I didn't notice until it had already covered the entire wall of my attention. Professor Alastair Finch. He wasn't the kind of handsome that stopped traffic. He was the kind that made you look twice, then a third time, trying to figure out what it was that held your gaze. He was a sculpture and painting professor, and I was a third-year art history major, which meant our paths only crossed in the largest, most impersonal lecture halls on campus. I was just another face in a sea of 200, a small body in a tiered auditorium, scribbling notes about chiaroscuro while he paced the stage. My life was a study in quiet observation. I lived in a small, single dorm room that always smelled faintly of stale coffee and old books. My days were a predictable circuit: library, lecture hall, dining commons, dorm. Repeat. I had acquaintances, people I'd nod to in class, but no real friends. I'd never been good at initiating, at breaking through the initial awkwardness into something real. So I watched. I watched the boisterous friend groups laughing on the quad, the couples holding hands on their way to the student union, and I watched Alastair Finch. He moved with a kind of grounded economy, no wasted gestures. When he pointed to a slide of a Caravaggio, his entire arm was a single, decisive line. He wore the same uniform almost every day: dark jeans, a plain gray or black t-shirt, and worn leather boots. His hair was dark and thick, a little too long, always looking like he'd just run his hands through it. There were threads of silver at his temples that caught the harsh lecture hall light. He had a way of pausing mid-sentence, his gaze sweeping over the auditorium, and for a fraction of a second, I would feel utterly, completely seen, even though I knew he was just looking at a blur of faces. It was a foolish, private fantasy. In a school with 30,000 students, I was functionally invisible. My loneliness was a quiet, constant hum beneath the surface of my days, a fact I had long ago accepted. The inciting incident, the pebble that starts the avalanche, arrived in the form of an email. It was from the art department, a generic blast sent to all majors. My finger hovered over the delete button, assuming it was another announcement for a student gallery opening I wouldn't attend. But the subject line snagged my attention: independent study opportunity, studio assistant for Professor Finch. My heart did a strange, painful lurch. The email described the position. A single student would be selected to assist Professor Finch in his private, on-campus studio. The work involved cataloging his early paintings and sketches for a major retrospective exhibition planned for the following year. It was a paid position, 15 hours a week. It wasn't for class credit, it was a job that required spending hours in close proximity to the man who occupied an unreasonable amount of my mental real estate. I read the requirements. A GPA over 35, familiarity with archival software, and a one-page letter explaining your interest. I met the first two criteria. The third was the problem. How could I possibly articulate my interest without sounding like the starstruck admirer I was? I am interested in this position because I enjoy quietly obsessing over you from a safe distance and would like to upgrade to a closer, more anxiety-inducing proximity. I snorted, the sound loud in my silent room. It was absurd. Dozens of ambitious, talented painting majors would be applying, students who had actually taken his classes, who had spoken to him. I was a nobody, an art historian, not an artist. But the thought of it wouldn't let me go. The image of his studio, a place I'd only heard whispers about, a vast, light-filled room at the top of the oldest building on campus, was intoxicating. The chance to be in that space, to see the work not as a finished product in a museum, but as a living, breathing thing, and to see him in his natural environment. It was a dangerous, stupid idea. So I did it anyway. I spent 2 days crafting a letter that was a masterpiece of professional yearning. I wrote about my passion for archival work, my interest in the narrative arc of an artist's career, from early sketches to mature masterpieces. I mentioned his early Marlborough Sky series, a collection of stark, beautiful landscapes from his time out west that no one ever talked about anymore, hoping it would show I'd done my research. I tried to make myself sound serious, competent, and utterly uninteresting as a person. I attached the letter to the application form, my hand trembling slightly as I clicked send. Then I closed my laptop and tried to forget about it, bracing myself for the inevitable silence. A week passed, then another. I settled back into my routine, the brief flare of hope extinguished. It had been a ridiculous long shot. I was in the library, deep in a book on Florentine architecture, when my phone buzzed with an email notification. The sender was Finch, Alistair. My breath hitched. I fumbled the phone, my fingers suddenly slick. The email was brutally brief. Leo, thank you for your application. Are you free to meet in my office tomorrow at 3 p.m. to discuss? Alistair Finch. That was it. No pleasantries. Just a time and a place. I spent the next 24 hours in a state of low-grade panic. I changed my outfit 3 times, finally settling on my nicest jeans, the dark ones without any frayed edges, and a plain navy blue sweater. It felt like preparing for a job interview and a first date all at once, and my body didn't know how to handle the conflicting signals. His office was on the 4th floor of the Arts Building, a cramped space that smelled overwhelmingly of turpentine and old paper. The door was ajar. I knocked softly. Come in, a low voice called. Alistair Finch was sitting behind a mountain of books and papers, his back to a large window that looked out over the campus green. Up close, he was both more and less intimidating than he was on stage. The lines around his eyes were deeper, etched from years of squinting at canvases. He had a smudge of what looked like charcoal on his jaw. He wasn't smiling, but his expression wasn't unkind. It was just neutral, focused. He gestured to the single, rickety-looking chair opposite his desk. Leo, he said. It wasn't a question. My name in his voice, that low, gravelly timbre, was a physical thing. It felt like it landed on my skin. Professor Finch, thank you for seeing me. I managed, my own voice sounding thin and reedy. He nodded, picking up a single sheet of paper from his desk. My letter. You mentioned the Marlborough Sky series. Yes. I saw a few pieces in a gallery in Santa Fe a couple of summers ago. They stuck with me. A flicker of something in his eyes. Surprise? Not many people remember those. I was 22. Trying to be Georgia O'Keeffe, a ghost of a smile touched his lips before vanishing. You're an art history major. Yes, sir. Not a painter. No. I can't draw a straight line. He leaned back in his chair, the leather groaning in protest. He studied me, his gaze steady and unervingly direct. It wasn't the sweeping glance of the lecture hall. This was focused, analytical. I felt like one of his still life subjects, a bowl of fruit being assessed for its texture and form. I fought the urge to squirm. The job is 90% tedium, he said, his voice flat. Scanning slides. Data entry. Moving heavy, dusty canvases. It's not glamorous. I understand that, I said, trying to sound earnest. I'm good with tedium. I find it calming. He raised an eyebrow at that, a small, almost imperceptible movement. Do you? He looked down at my letter again, then back at me. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. I could hear the frantic pounding of my own heart. Sure, he could hear it too. I was about to be politely dismissed. I'd made a mistake. He thought I was a weirdo who found tedium calming. The studio is a private space, Leo, he said, his tone shifting. It was quieter now, more serious. The work I do there, it's in progress. It's messy. I need someone who can be invisible when necessary. Someone quiet. I'm quiet, I said, the words coming out in a rush. It was the truest thing I could possibly say. He held my gaze for another long moment. I felt pinned by it. I couldn't decipher his expression. It was like looking at a calm, deep body of water. You knew there was a whole world underneath, but the surface gave nothing away. All right, he said finally. Just that one word. He stood up, and I scrambled to my feet. He was taller than I'd realized, lean but broad in the shoulders. 15 hours a week. We can work out a schedule that fits with your classes. Can you start Monday? My mind went completely blank. Yes, I heard myself say. Yes, of course. My studio is in the old observatory building. Top floor. I'll email you the code for the door. Be there at 9-inch. He walked to the door and held it open, a clear, polite dismissal. I walked back to my dorm in a daze. It didn't feel real. I had the job. I was going to be in his studio. The fear and excitement warred within me, a nauseating, thrilling cocktail. The ivy of my crush had just found a whole new wall to climb, and I had the distinct, terrifying feeling that I'd just willingly walked into the lion's den. The old observatory was the most beautiful and neglected building on campus, a domed stone structure covered in ivy, set apart from the modern glass and steel architecture of the main quad. It felt like stepping into another century. I climbed a winding spiral staircase, my footsteps echoing in the quiet. The top floor was just one door, a heavy oak slab with a modern keypad lock. My fingers were clumsy as I punched in the code Alistair had emailed me. The lock clicked open with a soft whir. I pushed the door open and stopped. The word studio didn't do it justice. The entire top floor was one enormous, circular room, the ceiling soaring up to a glass dome that flooded the space with pale morning light. Canvases in various states of completion were everywhere, leaning against walls, resting on massive easels. The air was thick with the holy trinity of an artist's studio, the sharp bite of turpentine, the earthy scent of oil paint, and the faint, dusty smell of old canvas. It was chaotic but clean, an organized storm of creation. Alistair was standing in the center of the room, his back to me, staring at a canvas that was at least 8 feet tall. He was wearing his usual uniform of jeans and a dark t-shirt, and he hadn't heard me come in. For a full minute, I just watched him. I watched the tension in his shoulders, the slight tilt of his head as he considered the work. He was utterly still, completely absorbed. This was him in his element, a world away from the performer on the lecture hall stage. This felt private. I felt like an intruder. I cleared my throat softly. Professor Finch. He turned, not startled, but slowly, as if surfacing from a deep dive. His eyes found me, and for a second, they were unfocused, still seeing the painting. Then they sharpened. Leo, you're punctual. You said 9. I said, my voice small in the cavernous room. I did. He gestured to a corner of the studio, where a sleek, modern desk was set up with a computer and what looked like a high-end scanner. It was the only truly orderly part of the entire space. That's your station. The first project is the slide collection. There are about 20 carousels of them in those boxes. They all need to be scanned, labeled, and digitally archived. The software is already installed. And so began my new routine. For hours, I sat at that desk, methodically taking tiny plastic squares from their slots, placing them on the scanner, and typing in dates and titles. It was exactly the kind of tedious work he had promised, and I loved every second of it, because it gave me the perfect excuse to observe. From my corner, I had a clear view of the entire studio. I learned the rhythm of his work. He didn't paint with frantic energy. He painted with a slow, deliberate intensity. There were long periods where he would do nothing but stand and look, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. Then he would move, mixing colors on a palette the size of a small table, his movements precise and economical. He worked with a quiet focus that was mesmerizing. I watched his hands. They were capable hands, stained with a permanent kaleidoscope of pigments around the nails and in the creases of his knuckles. I watched the muscles in his back and shoulders flex under his t-shirt as he stretched a new canvas. I learned the sound of his breathing, the soft scrape of his palette knife, the whisper of a brush on canvas. These sounds became the soundtrack to my days. Our interactions were minimal and strictly professional. He'd bring me coffee in the mornings, placing a heavy ceramic mug on my desk without a word. The coffee was always black and brutally strong. Sometimes he would ask me to help him move a large canvas, and my proximity to him would send a jolt through my system. He smelled of paint and that faint, clean scent of his soap, something simple and masculine, like cedar. My internal monologue was a constant, frantic hum of analysis. He'd walk past my desk, and his arm would brush my shoulder. Was that an accident? It had to be an accident, but he could have walked wider. There was plenty of room. Did he do it on purpose? Why would he do it on purpose? Stop it, Leo. You're being insane. He'd be working, and I'd feel his eyes on me. I'd look up from my computer, and he'd be staring, not at me, but sort of through me, his artist's gaze analytical. Then he'd blink, as if realizing he was staring, and turn back to his canvas. My heart would hammer in my chest for 10 minutes afterward. What was he looking at? The way the light hit my hair? The shape of my jaw? Or was he just trying to remember if he needed more burnt sienna? My mind was a tireless engine of self-torture, manufacturing meaning out of thin air. The first time he touched me with any kind of deliberation was about 3 weeks in. I was trying to lift a heavy box of old sketchbooks onto a high shelf. I was struggling, my arms trembling. Here, his low voice came from directly behind me. I hadn't even heard him approach. Before I could protest, his hands were on my waist, firm and warm, and he lifted me slightly, just enough to give me the leverage I needed to slide the box into place. It was a perfectly practical, logical gesture, but his hand stayed there for a second too long after the box was on the shelf. I could feel the heat of his palms through the thin fabric of my sweater. My entire body went rigid. Then he stepped back. "Thanks," I mumbled, not turning around, my face burning. "Be careful with those," was all he said, his voice its usual neutral tone. "Some of that paper is over 20 years old." I stood there for a full minute after he walked away, my back to the room, trying to get my breathing under control. His touch lingered, a phantom pressure on my hips. It was nothing. It was a helpful gesture. But my overthinking mind seized on it, replaying it, analyzing it, dissecting the exact pressure of his fingers, the duration of the contact. It was a crumb, and I was starving. The days bled into weeks. The first snow of the season fell, blanketing the campus in white and making the studio feel even more like a self-contained world, a snow globe with just the two of us inside. I finished scanning the slides and moved on to photographing his older canvases. This required more interaction. I needed his help to move the larger pieces into the proper light. A little to the left, I'd say, peering through the camera lens. He would shift the massive canvas an inch. Our hands would brush. My pulse would skyrocket. "Is that good?" he'd ask, his voice patient. "Perfect," I'd lie, because my vision would be blurry from the sudden rush of blood to my head. One afternoon, I was trying to get a detail shot of a thick impasto swirl of blue paint. I was contorting myself, trying to get the angle right without casting a shadow. "You're going to put your back out," he said. He was suddenly beside me, his presence a solid warmth. He took the camera from my hands. "Show me what you're trying to get." I pointed, my finger hovering over the canvas. "That part. The texture there." He leaned in, his head close to mine. I could smell the coffee on his breath, see the tiny flecks of gold in his brown eyes. He was so close I could feel the heat radiating from his body. I held my breath. My entire universe shrank to the few inches of space between us. "I see," he said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate through my bones. He lifted the camera and took the shot with an effortless ease that I, with all my fumbling, could never manage. He handed the camera back to me, his fingers grazing mine. The contact was brief, incidental, but it felt like a brand. "Thanks," I whispered, my voice hoarse. He just nodded and went back to his own work, as if nothing had happened. But something had happened. The professional boundary between us, once a solid wall, was beginning to feel porous, permeable. Or maybe I was just projecting my own desperate fantasies onto these small, meaningless interactions. I couldn't tell. The uncertainty was excruciating. The breakthrough, when it came, was quiet and unexpected. It was a Tuesday night in early December. A nasty, wet snow was turning to ice outside, and the wind howled around the old observatory. I had stayed late to finish cataloging a series of charcoal drawings. Alistair was working on a new sculpture, a life-sized figure he was building up from a wire armature and clay. He'd been wrestling with it for weeks, adding and removing clay, his frustration a palpable presence in the room. Around 8 o'clock, the lights flickered, then died. The entire room plunged into an absolute, disorienting blackness. The only sound was the wind and my own sharp intake of breath. "Stay put." Alistair's voice cut through the darkness, calm and steady. It was a command. A few seconds later, there was the click and flare of a lighter, then the soft, warm glow of a candle. He was standing by his workbench, his face cast in dramatic, dancing shadows. He looked like a figure from one of the Baroque paintings I studied. "Power grid must be down," he said, lighting a few more thick candles he had arranged on a metal tray. The studio was transformed, the familiar space now a cavern of flickering light and deep shadows. The half-finished canvases looked ghostly, their colors muted and strange. "I should probably go," I said, my voice sounding uncertain. "The roads will be a sheet of ice," he countered, his tone practical. "And you won't be able to see a thing on that spiral staircase. We'll wait it out. It's usually not off for long." He disappeared into a small alcove I knew contained a kitchenette and returned with 2 mugs and a metal thermos. "Emergency coffee," he said, a hint of humor in his voice. He poured the steaming liquid into the mugs. He handed one to me, our fingers brushing in the exchange. This time, The touch felt different. Less accidental. More companionable. We sat on a low wooden bench, the candlelight flickering between us. The usual dynamic of professor and assistant, artist and observer, evaporated in the strange, intimate darkness. We were just two people, trapped by a storm. "So," he said, breaking the silence. "Art history. Why?" The question surprised me. He'd never asked me anything personal before. "I don't know," I said honestly. "I like stories. And every painting feels like a story to me. The artist's story, the subject's story, the story of the time it was made in." He nodded slowly, sipping his coffee, his eyes on the candle flame. "And what do you want to do with these stories? Become a curator? A critic?" "I'm not sure," I admitted, feeling a familiar pang of anxiety about my future. "Maybe work in a museum. In the archives, probably. Away from the public." "You like to stay in the background," he stated. It wasn't a question. It was an observation. A shockingly accurate one. "I guess," I said, my cheeks feeling warm. "I'm better at watching." "There's nothing wrong with watching," he said quietly. "But sometimes you have to get your hands dirty." He looked at his own hands, the ingrained stains of paint dark in the low light. We sat in a comfortable silence for a while, the kind of silence that doesn't need to be filled. The wind howled outside, but in our candlelit bubble, it felt safe. Warm. "Tell me about the Marlborough Sky paintings," I asked, feeling a sudden surge of boldness. "You said you were trying to be Georgia O'Keeffe." He let out a low chuckle. I'd just dropped out of business school. My father was not pleased. I took what little money I had and drove out to New Mexico. Lived in a terrible little shack for 6 months and just painted. I thought I was being profound. I was mostly just cold and hungry. He spoke about that time with a wry, self-deprecating humor I'd never heard from him before. He talked about the loneliness, the vastness of the sky, the feeling of being utterly insignificant against the landscape. He was admitting a vulnerability, a past self that was uncertain and struggling. It was a gift. He was letting me see a part of him that wasn't the confident, revered Professor Finch. He was showing me Alistair. I learned more in those 6 months than in any art class. He finished, his voice soft. I learned how to see, and I learned that I was a terrible landscape painter. "I don't think they're terrible," I said quietly. "They're honest." He looked at me then, his gaze direct and intense across the flickering flames. The analytical quality was gone. This was something else, something softer and more searching. I felt that look deep in my gut. "Honest," he repeated, as if tasting the word. "Maybe." Just then, the lights flickered back on with a hum, flooding the studio with harsh, fluorescent brightness. The spell was broken. We both blinked, disoriented. The intimate, shadowy world vanished, replaced by the familiar, clinical reality of the studio. The moment of softness was over. "Well," he said, standing up and stretching. "About time." The professional mask was back in place, but not quite as securely as before. I could still see the man who had been cold and hungry in New Mexico. "I should go," I said, gathering my things. The awkwardness returned, but it was a different flavor now. It was tinged with the memory of that shared vulnerability. "Drive safe, Leo," he said as I headed for the door. "I will," I promised. That night, lying in my dorm bed, I didn't replay the incidental touches. I replayed the conversation. I replayed the way he looked at me across the candlelight. Something had shifted between us. A wall had come down, brick by brick, and I had the distinct feeling that he had been the one to dismantle it. The quiet observer was slowly, terrifyingly, being drawn out of the background. The atmosphere in the studio after the power outage was thick with unspoken things. The old dynamic was gone, replaced by a tense, fragile awareness. We were both hyper-conscious of each other's presence. The silences were no longer just the quiet of two people working. They were heavy with subtext, filled with the words we weren't saying. I found myself fumbling with my tasks, my focus shot. My entire being was attuned to him, to his movements, to the sound of his breathing across the room. He was still struggling with the clay figure. It was a male nude, posed in a way that was both powerful and vulnerable. He'd work on it for hours, his hands moving over the clay, shaping a shoulder, defining the line of a back, only to scrape it all away in a fit of frustration. The pile of discarded clay on the floor grew daily. One afternoon, he was standing before it, his face a mask of concentration, his jaw tight. I was at my desk, pretending to organize files, but really I was just watching him. He turned his head, and his eyes landed on me. He held my gaze for a long, unnerving moment. The air crackled. "Have you ever felt truly seen, Leo?" he asked, his voice low but carrying clearly across the large room. The question struck me like a physical blow. It was so direct, so out of the blue, so intensely personal. It had nothing to do with art history or cataloging. It had everything to do with the conversation in the dark, with the way he'd been looking at me for weeks. My mouth went dry. I don't know what you mean," I stammered, a pathetic defense. "Seen," he repeated, his gaze unwavering. "Not just looked at. Seen. For who you are." I couldn't answer. The truth was a hard knot in my throat. No, I had never felt that. My entire life had been a masterclass in not being seen. To admit that felt like stripping myself bare in the middle of this vast, light-filled room. He didn't press for an answer. He just held my gaze for another moment, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes, empathy, understanding, before turning back to his sculpture. But the question remained, hanging in the air between us for the rest of the day, a live wire I was terrified to touch. The next day, the tension was even worse. He was quiet, withdrawn. I kept to my corner, my heart pounding a nervous rhythm against my ribs. Around midday, it wasn't a harsh command, but it wasn't a request either. I stood up slowly, my legs feeling unsteady. He was close, closer than he'd ever been. I had to tilt my head back slightly to meet his eyes. "I need to see something," he said, his voice quiet, almost rough. "For the sculpture. The line of the neck and shoulder. I can't get it right." My mind raced. This was a pretext. It had to be. But what if it wasn't? What if this was just the artist needing a reference? "Turn," he said, placing a hand on my shoulder to guide me. His touch was firm, definite. I turned so my side was to him. "Just stand there." For a moment, I stood, rigid and self-conscious, my eyes fixed on a distant canvas. I was acutely aware of his closeness, of the warmth of his body just inches from mine. I could hear him breathing. I could hear the soft scratch of charcoal on paper. He was sketching me. My skin prickled. I felt like I was under a microscope. He was looking at me with that intense, analytical artist's gaze, but it felt different now. It was charged with everything that had passed between us, the lingering touches, the conversation in the dark, his impossible question. This wasn't just about a line on a sculpture. He was studying me, learning the shape of me. "Lift your chin a little," he murmured. I obeyed, my throat tight. The scratching sound continued for what felt like an eternity. I was so focused on not moving, on breathing evenly, that I almost didn't feel his hand on the back of my neck. His thumb stroked the sensitive skin just below my hairline, a slow, deliberate movement. A shudder went through me. It was an involuntary reaction, a current of electricity arcing from that single point of contact through my entire body. The scratching stopped. The silence was deafening. His hand was still on my neck, his thumb resting now at the base of my skull. I didn't dare to breathe. "Leo," he said, his voice a low, strained whisper. I slowly turned my head to look at him. His face was inches from mine. The artist's mask was gone. In its place was a raw, naked vulnerability that mirrored my own. His eyes were dark with an emotion I couldn't name, but I felt it in the pit of my stomach. It was yearning. It was the same desperate ache that had been living inside me for months. He dropped his hand as if he'd been burned, taking a half step back. The connection was broken. He looked down at the sketchbook in his hand, then closed it with a sharp snap. "Thank you," he said, his voice clipped and formal again. "That was helpful." He walked back to his side of the studio without another word, leaving me standing there, trembling, my skin still humming where he had touched me. The interaction had lasted maybe 3 minutes, but it had changed everything. The subtext was now text. The question wasn't if something was happening between us, but what we were going to do about it. And that was the most terrifying thought of all. The final week before the winter break was a special kind of hell. The tension was a living entity in the studio, a third person in the room with us. We moved around each other with a careful, stilted choreography, avoiding eye contact, our conversations limited to curt, necessary exchanges about the cataloging work. The air was so thick with unspoken feelings I felt like I was wading through water. Every time he came near my desk, my entire nervous system would light up in a panic. The memory of his thumb on my neck was a constant, phantom sensation. I was miserable. I was convinced I had ruined everything. I had imagined the look in his eyes, the charge in his touch. He was regretting his brief lapse in professionalism, and now he was just waiting for the semester to end so he could be rid of me. The thought was a cold, heavy weight in my chest. It was the last day. I had finished the last of the photography, and all the files were organized, labeled, and backed up. My job was done. I spent the afternoon quietly packing my few personal belongings from the desk, a mug, a pen holder, a small succulent I'd brought in to make the space feel a little more mine. Each item felt like a nail in the coffin of this strange, intense chapter of my life. Alistair hadn't spoken more than 10 words to me all day. He was attacking his clay figure with a renewed, almost violent energy, scraping away whole sections, his jaw set in a hard line. He was closing himself off, building his walls back up, and I was on the outside. By 5 o'clock, the winter sun was already setting, casting long, dramatic shadows across the studio floor. My small box of belongings was packed. There was nothing left to do. This was it. I had to say goodbye. I walked over to where he was working, my steps feeling heavy, leaden. "Alistair," I said, my voice barely a whisper. It was the first time I'd used his given name aloud. He stopped working but didn't turn around. I could see the tension in his broad back. "It's all done," I continued, my voice trembling slightly. "The files are on the main drive. I guess this is it." He remained silent, his back to me. My heart sank. This was the brush-off. He wasn't even going to look at me. Tears pricked at the back of my eyes, hot and shameful. I had been so stupid. "Thank you for the opportunity," I said formally, turning to leave. I had to get out of there before I completely fell apart. "Leo." His voice stopped me. It was strained, rough. I paused, my hand on the strap of my messenger bag, my back still to him. Slowly, I turned around. He had turned to face me. His hands were covered in wet clay. His face was stark in the fading light, his expression etched with a deep, consuming conflict. He looked wrecked. He took a step toward me, then another. He didn't stop until he was standing directly in front of me, so close I could see the frantic pulse beating in his throat. He looked from my eyes to my mouth and back again. The air was electric, vibrating with all the tension we had so carefully cultivated for weeks. This was the tipping point. This was the moment where everything would either shatter or coalesce. He didn't speak. He just looked at me, his eyes dark and searching, and I saw everything he'd been holding back. The frustration, the confusion, the yearning. It was all there. And in that moment, I knew I hadn't imagined it. He lifted a hand, then seemed to remember it was covered in clay and let it drop to his side. The aborted gesture was more intimate than any touch. "Don't go," he said, the words a low, ragged plea. My carefully constructed composure crumbled. All the fear, the anxiety, the desperate hope, it all rushed to the surface. I didn't know what to say, what to do. I just stood there, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. He took a deep breath, his gaze never leaving mine. "Come here," he said softly. It wasn't a question. He gestured with his head toward the center of the studio, toward a large, sturdy workbench that was cleared of all tools, its dark wood gleaming in the twilight. I moved as if in a trance, my legs shaky. I walked past the forlorn clay figure and stopped in front of the workbench. He followed me. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the sound of our own unsteady breathing. He put his hands on the bench, one on either side of me, caging me in. He leaned closer, his forehead almost touching mine. "I can't think when you're here," he whispered, his voice raw. "And I can't think when you're not. It's a problem. My mind is a blank slate. White noise. There is only the feeling of his presence, a gravitational force pulling all my senses toward him. His proximity is overwhelming. I can smell the clay on his hands, the sharp scent of turpentine that clings to his clothes, and underneath it all, the warm, masculine scent that is just him. Alistair." His hands move from the bench to my hips. They are firm, grounding. His thumbs pressed gently into the hollows just above my hip bones. I suck in a sharp breath. This is not an accidental brush. This is not a practical gesture. This is deliberate. This is intentional. I feel the warmth of his hands seep through my jeans, through my sweater, and spread like wildfire through my entire body. He looks at me, his eyes searching mine for something. Permission? Hesitation? Fear? I don't know what he sees there. I only know that I am completely transparent, all my weeks of yearning and secret obsession laid bare for him to see. I am terrified. I am ecstatic. Without a word, he tightens his grip on my hips and lifts. My feet leave the floor. For a surreal second, I am weightless. Then he is setting me down, seating me on the edge of the heavy workbench. The wood is cool against the backs of my thighs. The change in elevation is a seismic shift in our dynamic. I am no longer looking up at him. We are eye level. His face is inches from mine. I can see the exhaustion in his eyes, the conflict, but underneath it, there is a fierce, burning resolve. My hands have come to rest on his shoulders. I don't remember putting them there. The fabric of his t-shirt is soft and worn under my palms. I can feel the solid muscle beneath. He is so real, so tangible, after existing for so long as a fantasy in my head. He doesn't kiss me. Not yet. The anticipation is a physical thing, a tightening in my chest, a humming under my skin. This moment is more important than a kiss. This is the confession. His gaze drops from my eyes to my mouth, then travels slowly down my neck, over my chest. It is a tangible caress, a look that touches. Leo, he breathes, and my name is a prayer, a curse, an admission. His hands slide from my hips up my sides, his thumbs brushing the bottom of my ribs. My heart is going to beat its way out of my chest. I am not breathing. I am watching his face, watching the decision flicker in his eyes. He is going to pull away. He is going to apologize and step back, and the moment will be lost forever. But he doesn't. Instead, his hands find the hem of my sweater. He hesitates for a fraction of a second, his knuckles brushing against the bare skin of my stomach. The contact is electric. A jolt goes through me, sharp and sweet. His eyes flick up to mine, asking a silent question. I give him a nod, a tiny, almost imperceptible movement, but he sees it. Slowly, so slowly, he begins to pull my sweater up. The wool slides over my stomach, my chest. I lift my arms automatically, helping him. He pulls it over my head, and for a moment I am in darkness, the scent of my own skin and laundry detergent filling my senses. Then the sweater is gone, and the cool air of the studio hits my bare chest. He tosses the sweater onto a nearby stool without looking. His eyes are fixed on me, just looking. His gaze is intense, reverent. It is the same look he gives his canvases when he is trying to find the truth in them. He is trying to find the truth in me. And I realize, with a sudden, gut-wrenching clarity, this is what he meant. This is being seen. His hands come up, but they don't touch me yet. They hover inches from my skin, trembling slightly. Clay-dusted fingers. Capable artist's hands. I can feel the heat coming off them. He is giving me every opportunity to stop him, to tell him no. But no is the furthest word from my mind. Finally, he lets his right hand come to rest on my chest, flat over my heart. I can feel my own frantic pulse beating against his palm. His skin is rough, calloused, but his touch is unbelievably gentle. He closes his eyes for a second, as if committing the feeling to memory. This, he says, his voice thick, is what I couldn't get right. He opens his eyes, and they are blazing. This. His other hand comes to my jaw, his thumb stroking along the bone. He leans in, closing the last few inches between us. His lips are a breath away from mine. Is this okay? He whispers, his breath warm against my mouth. Yes. I breathe out, the word dissolving between us. And then he kisses me. It is not a gentle kiss. It is hungry, desperate, a release of weeks of coiled tension. It is the taste of coffee and longing. His lips are firm, demanding, and I meet him with an equal, surprising force. All the watching, all the yearning, all the silent, secret pining pours into this single point of contact. My hands fist in his shirt, pulling him closer, and he groans into my mouth, a low, guttural sound of pure relief. He presses in, his body flush against my knees, one hand still tangled in my hair, the other sliding down my back, pulling me tight against him. This is not a question anymore. This is an answer. A loud, resounding, undeniable yes. It is not rushed. It is honest. It feels like coming home. The kiss gentled, shifting from frantic need to a slow, deep exploration. His lips softened against mine, and the hand on my back moved with a tender possessiveness, learning the curve of my spine. When we finally broke apart, we were both breathless, our foreheads resting against each other. My eyes were closed. I didn't want to open them. I wanted to stay in this perfect, suspended moment forever. Leo, he murmured again, his voice thick with emotion. He pressed a soft kiss to my temple, then my cheekbone, then the corner of my mouth. He wasn't trying to start anything more. It was just a reaffirmation. This is real. This happened. I finally opened my eyes. He was looking at me with an expression of such unguarded tenderness it almost broke my heart. The revered professor, the stoic artist, all of that had fallen away. This was just Alistair, a man looking at another man with a profound, terrifying hope. He slowly pulled back, though his hands remained on me, one on my back, one still cupping my jaw. He looked around the studio, at the canvases and the half-finished sculpture, as if seeing it all for the first time. "We can't stay here," he said, his voice regaining some of its usual steadiness, though the rough edge of emotion was still there. He looked back at me. "My house. Come home with me." It wasn't a proposition for a one-night stand. It was an invitation, an offer to leave this strange, charged bubble we had created and step into the real world. Together. "Okay," I said, my voice quiet but sure. He helped me down from the workbench, his hands lingering at my waist. He picked up my sweater and held it out to me. As I pulled it on, my skin still tingling from the cool air and his touch, he went to the small kitchenette to wash the clay from his hands. I watched him, the simple, domestic act feeling impossibly intimate. He turned off the lights, plunging the studio into the near darkness of the winter evening, only the city glow coming through the glass dome. He took my hand, his fingers lacing with mine. The connection felt solid, real. He led me out the door and down the winding spiral staircase, our footsteps the only sound in the silent, historic building. The cold night air hit us as we stepped outside, and I shivered, but his hand was warm in mine, a steady anchor in a world that had just been completely, irrevocably rearranged. I woke up slowly, disoriented. The light was different, soft and gray, filtering through unfamiliar blinds. The sheets smelled like him, that clean, cedar scent, and something else, something uniquely Alistair. I was in his bed, in his house. I turned my head on the pillow. He was gone. Panic, cold and immediate, seized me. Of course he was gone. It was a mistake. A moment of weakness fueled by weeks of tension. He'd woken up, seen me in his bed, and regretted everything. The memory of the previous night, the drive to his house, the quiet way he'd led me inside, the feverish, tender hours spent in this very bed, felt like a dream, fragile and already fading. The reality was this empty space beside me. I sat up, my heart pounding a sick, heavy rhythm. The room was simple, masculine. Bookshelves overflowing, a few framed prints on the walls, his own early sketches. His clothes were draped over a chair. It was a lived-in, comfortable space, and I felt like an alien in it. I had to get out. I couldn't face him. I couldn't bear to see the regret in his eyes, the polite, professional mask sliding back into place. I slipped out of bed, my bare feet cold on the hardwood floor. My jeans and sweater were folded neatly on a wooden chest at the foot of the bed. I pulled them on, my movements clumsy with haste. I just needed to find my shoes and my bag and disappear. I could walk back to campus. It would be a long, cold walk of shame, but it was better than the alternative. I crept out of the bedroom and into a hallway. The house was small and quiet. I could hear the faint hum of a refrigerator. The smell of coffee was in the air. My stomach clenched. He was awake. He was in the kitchen. There was no way to get to the front door without passing the kitchen entrance. I took a deep breath, steeling myself. Just walk past. Don't look. Don't say anything. Just escape. I tiptoed down the hall, my socked feet silent on the floorboards. I was almost past the kitchen doorway when his voice stopped me. "Leo." It was quiet, not sharp or angry. Just my name. I froze, my back to him. I couldn't turn around. I couldn't face the pity or the dismissal. "I was making coffee," he said, his voice still quiet. The sound of him setting a mug down on a counter. "I didn't want to wake you." The silence stretched. I was still frozen, my whole body rigid with dread. I felt him move, heard the soft padding of his feet. He came to stand behind me, not touching, but close enough that I could feel his warmth. "Look at me," he said softly. I couldn't. I just shook my head, my eyes squeezed shut. "I should go," I mumbled, The words thick in my throat. Why? The question was so simple, so genuine, it disarmed me. Because this is the part where you regret it. Because people like me don't get to have things like this. Because I am an expert in being left. The words swirled in my head, but I couldn't say them. A warm hand settled on my shoulder, turning me gently to face him. I kept my eyes fixed on the floor, on the worn wooden planks. He placed a finger under my chin and tilted my head up, forcing me to meet his gaze. His eyes were clear, steady. There was no regret there. No anger. Only a quiet, searching concern. He was wearing a soft, gray Henley. His hair was tousled from sleep, and he looked soft, approachable. I woke up this morning, he said, his voice a low, soothing rumble. And for the first time in a very long time, I felt calm. He searched my face. I didn't regret it, Leo. Not for a second. I was just afraid you did. The sincerity in his voice was a physical blow, knocking the wind out of me, shattering the panic and the fear. Tears I hadn't even realized were there welled in my eyes and spilled over. One tracked down my cheek. He caught it with his thumb, his touch impossibly gentle. Oh, I whispered, the sound broken. It was all I could manage. He pulled me into a hug, his arms wrapping around me, holding me securely. I buried my face in his chest, my hands clutching the back of his shirt. He just held me, one hand stroking my hair, letting me absorb the truth of his words. He wasn't pushing me away. He was holding me closer. I made coffee, he murmured into my hair after a long moment. And I was about to attempt to make pancakes, but my skills are questionable. Stay? Have breakfast with me. I pulled back just enough to look at him, a watery, hesitant smile on my face. Okay, I said, but maybe I should handle the pancakes. A real smile broke across his face then, lighting up his eyes, and the last of the morning's chill melted away. Deal, he said. He took my hand, his fingers lacing through mine, and led me into the bright, warm kitchen. The reassurance wasn't a grand declaration. It was a quiet offer of coffee and pancakes, a simple, grounding promise of a morning spent together. The winter break was a strange and wonderful limbo. The university was a ghost town, my dorm was empty and cold, so I spent most of my time at Alistair's house. We existed in a quiet, domestic bubble. We cooked together. It turned out my pancake skills were far superior. Went for long walks in the snow-covered woods behind his house, and spent hours just talking. He was a different person away from the studio and the university. He was lighter, quicker to smile. He had a dry, witty sense of humor that surprised me. I learned about his estranged family of doctors and lawyers, his love for old black and white movies, his utter inability to keep houseplants alive. I, in turn, found myself opening up in ways I never had before. I told him about my quiet, lonely childhood, my bookish parents, my persistent feeling of being an observer on the sidelines of my own life. He listened with an unnerving stillness, his focus absolute. He made me feel interesting. He made me feel seen. But even in our peaceful bubble, a seed of anxiety began to sprout within me. This was all temporary. The break would end. The spring semester would start. What were we then? He was still Professor Finch. I was still Leo, a student. The power dynamic that had felt so distant in the privacy of his home would come rushing back the second we stepped on campus. What would happen to us when this idyllic interlude was over? The fear was a quiet hum beneath the surface of my happiness. I didn't dare voice it. I didn't want to break the spell. I was terrified that if I questioned it, if I tried to define what we were, the whole fragile structure would collapse. So I pushed the anxiety down and focused on the present, the warmth of his hand in mine, the comfortable silence as we read side by side on his sofa, the way he would look at me from across the room with that soft, tender expression that still made my heart ache. The test came on the first day of the new semester. Walking onto the bustling campus felt like re-entering a world I no longer belonged to. The familiar paths and buildings seemed strange, altered by the profound changes in my own life. I saw Alistair from a distance, walking across the main quad, deep in conversation with another professor. He was Professor Finch again, composed, professional, a respected figure of authority. He didn't see me. A cold knot of dread formed in my stomach. Our bubble had burst. I had a class in the afternoon, so I didn't go to the studio. I didn't know if I was supposed to. My job was over. I had no reason to be there. The thought of not going back, of not having that shared space with him anymore, was a physical pain. After my last class, I found myself walking toward the old observatory, as if on autopilot. I stood at the bottom of the spiral staircase for a long time, my heart pounding. What was I doing? Was I just going to show up? What if he was busy? What if he didn't want me there? I almost turned around a dozen times, but something propelled me up the stairs. I reached the heavy oak door, my hand hovering over the keypad. Did the code still work? Did he change it? Taking a shaky breath, I punched in the familiar numbers. The lock clicked open. I pushed the door open tentatively. The studio was quiet, filled with the golden light of the late afternoon. Alistair was there, standing in front of his easel, but he wasn't painting. He was just standing there, his back to the door. He turned, as if he had sensed my presence. His face was unreadable. "Leo," he said. His voice was flat. The cold dread intensified. This was it. This was the end. "I'm sorry," I said, my voice coming out in a rush. "I shouldn't have. My job is over. I'll go." "Is that what you want?" he asked, his gaze steady. "No," I admitted, the word a raw whisper. He walked toward me, closing the distance between us. He stopped a few feet away, maintaining a careful, professional distance. The space between us felt like a canyon. "I saw you on the quad today," he said. "I wanted to come over, but I didn't know what the rules were." He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of frustration I had come to recognize. "This is new territory for me, Leo. I don't know how to do this." The confession of uncertainty, coming from him, was disarming. He was just as lost as I was. "Me neither," I said. "I was afraid. I thought now that we're back here, that I would pretend the last 2 weeks didn't happen." He finished for me, a flicker of pain in his eyes. He shook his head. "No, never." He took a deep breath. "The independent study is over. The job is over." He took a step closer, closing half the distance between us. "But we're not over. Unless you want us to be." He was giving me an out. He was making it clear that I had a choice. All my anxiety, all my fear of him regretting it, of the power imbalance, it was all my own creation. He was standing here, making himself vulnerable, asking me what I wanted. I looked at him, at this brilliant, complicated, wonderful man who had seen me when I felt invisible, and the choice was the easiest one I had ever made. "I don't want us to be over," I said, my voice clear and steady for the first time all day. A slow smile spread across his face, a smile of pure, unadulterated relief. He closed the last bit of distance between us, wrapped his arms around my waist, and lifted me off the ground in a hug that was both joyful and grounding. He buried his face in my neck, and I could feel him smiling against my skin. "Good," he murmured. "That's good." He set me down, but didn't let go. He held my face in his hands, his expression serious now. "It might be complicated," he said. "People might talk. Are you prepared for that?" "I don't care," I said, and I was surprised to find that I meant it. For the first time in my life, I didn't care what other people might think. All that mattered was the man standing in front of me, the solid feel of his hands on my face, the hope in his eyes. "I'm not in the background anymore." His smile returned, softer this time, full of a deep, quiet happiness. He leaned in and kissed me, a slow, sweet kiss that tasted like a promise. It wasn't the desperate, frantic kiss of our first time in the studio. This was calm. This was sure. This was a beginning. The spring semester unfolded with a quiet, domestic rhythm. Our relationship found its shape in the spaces between our public and private lives. On campus, we were discreet. He was Professor Finch, and I was Leo. We'd exchange brief, professional nods if we passed on the quad. But there were stolen moments, a shared glance across a crowded room that held a world of meaning, a brief touch of hands as he passed me a book in the library that sent a jolt up my arm. These small, secret communications were a thrill, a silent language that only we understood. The studio remained our sanctuary. Though my official job was over, I still had the code. I would go there between my classes, and we would fall back into our comfortable rhythm. I'd read on the low bench while he painted, the quiet filled with the familiar sounds of his work. Sometimes he would ask for my opinion on a piece, his head tilted as he listened to my thoughts with a genuine respect that still humbled me. He finished the clay figure, and it was magnificent. It didn't look like me, not literally, but he had captured something of that feeling of vulnerable strength we had both been grappling with. He called it the observer. But the best moments were at his house. Evenings were spent tangled together on his sofa, watching old movies, his arm a heavy, comforting weight around my shoulders. We'd cooked dinner together, our movements an easy dance in the small kitchen. I started leaving things there, a toothbrush, a change of clothes, a few of my favorite books. The house began to feel less like his and more like ours. One Saturday in April, we drove out of the city, heading west into the rolling hills. The landscape was bursting with the fierce green of spring. Alistair was quiet as he drove, one hand on the wheel, the other resting on my knee. It was a comfortable silence, the kind we had perfected over the months. After about an hour, he turned down a long, unpaved driveway. At the end of it was a small, rustic cabin surrounded by tall pine trees. It was old and weathered, but it had a sturdy, peaceful look to it. "What is this place?" I asked as he parked the car. "It was my grandparents'," he said, turning off the engine. "They left it to me. I come out here when I need to clear my head, when the city gets too loud." He led me inside. It was one big room, with a stone fireplace, a small kitchen, and a loft for sleeping. It smelled of wood smoke and pine. It was simple, quiet, and beautiful. It felt like him. We spent the day walking in the woods, not talking much, just enjoying the silence and the sun filtering through the trees. As evening approached, we built a fire in the hearth. We sat on a worn rug in front of it, drinking cheap wine from coffee mugs, the firelight dancing on our faces. He was looking at the flames, his expression thoughtful. "I was thinking," he said, his voice low, "about the retrospective next year. It's in New York. I'll have to be there for a few months to oversee the installation." My heart gave a familiar, anxious lurch. A few months. It felt like a lifetime. He turned to look at me, his eyes serious in the firelight. "Come with me," he said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement. An assumption that of course I would come. "Alistair, I have classes," I said, the practical objection sounding weak even to my own ears. "I'll be in my final year. You can take a semester off. Or we can figure out a way for you to take classes there." "We'll figure it out," he said, his confidence a calming balm on my anxiety. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a single, old-fashioned brass key. He pressed it into my palm. "What's this for?" I asked, looking at the key. "It's for the cabin," he said. "It's yours. For when I'm not here. For whenever you want it. For always." He closed my fingers around the key. "The project in the studio is over, Leo. The semester will be over. But I don't want this to be something that's just over. I want a future. With you." I looked from the key in my hand to his face. His earnest, hopeful, loving face. All the lingering fear, the insecurity, the feeling that I was just a temporary visitor in his life. It all dissolved in the warmth of the fire, in the weight of the key in my hand. He wasn't just offering me a key to a cabin. He was offering me a key to his life. A place to belong. I didn't need to say anything. I just leaned in and kissed him, a kiss full of gratitude and a deep, profound love that felt as solid and enduring as the old stone fireplace. The final scene of my story doesn't take place in a dramatic studio or a romantic cabin. It's a quiet Sunday morning, weeks later, back at his house. I wake up to the smell of coffee and pancakes. He's still trying to master them. I slip out of bed and pad into the kitchen. He's standing at the stove, humming softly to himself, silhouetted by the bright morning sun streaming through the window. I come up behind him and wrap my arms around his waist, resting my cheek against his back. He leans back into me, his body warm and familiar. "Morning," he murmurs, flipping a pancake with a practiced flick of his wrist. He's getting better. "Morning," I reply, my voice thick with sleep. We stand there for a moment in comfortable silence, just breathing together. The quiet domesticity of the scene, the simple intimacy of it, fills me with a sense of peace so deep it's almost overwhelming. I think back to the person I was less than a year ago, the quiet, lonely boy in the back of the lecture hall, watching this man from a distance, convinced he was invisible. I remember the fear, the obsessive overthinking, the certainty that I was unworthy of this kind of happiness. It feels like a lifetime ago, like a story about someone else. He turns in my arms to face me, a smear of flour on his cheek. He smiles that slow, beautiful smile that still makes my stomach flip. "I love you," he says, his voice soft. "I love you too," I say, and the words are easy, natural, true. He leans down and kisses me, a soft, flour-dusted kiss that tastes like coffee and maple syrup and home. In that moment, surrounded by the mundane beauty of a Sunday morning, I know with an unshakable certainty that my time as an observer is over. I am not on the sidelines anymore. I am here. I am seen. I am loved. And I have finally come home.